We now look at substances and substrata, written by me. One of my early publications in the Australian Journal of Philosophy, published in September 1994. I included it for a couple reasons. One is to provide an example of what a contemporary journal article would look like in metaphysics, and also because it surveys the notions of tropes, universals, substances, and substrata. And also, having written it, I know it fairly well. So, the objective of this paper is to look at tropes versus universals, and if you accept tropes, which I argue for in the paper, should you pick tropes and substrata, having a substrate under them, or should you just go with bundles of tropes? Now, to set a context for discussing, this matter, I went with the example of 6 blue marbles, because marbles are super exciting. So imagine we happen to have 6 blue marbles that are different sizes. So, looked at neutrally, color would occur here as a type, namely there is blue, and also as a token, because there are 6 instances of blue, because we have 6 blue marbles. Shape would also appear here as a type and a token, because there are 6 instances of sphericalness, and you'd also say there is a type of sphericalness. And of course, for each size, there is 1 instance for each size, and of course 6 different sizes. So how would the, 2 main competing theories here, in terms of universals versus tropes, how would they look at this marble scenario? So, take what are called imminent universals, and that means that the universals are here, as opposed to transcendent universals, which are the sort endorsed by our good dead friend Plato. Our good dead friend Aristotle embraced imminent universals because, in his view, they're here. Now, how do we define imminent universals a bit more technically? Well, here's the idea. An imminent universal is a property that can be wholly, entirely located in many different locations at the same dimension, at the same time. That's to say, they have the capacity for multiple location. So if we take the example of, blue, if you believe that there are imminent universals and you believe blue is one of these, every single blue is entirely, the form or universal of blue, but it's at different places. And again, we saw this when we talked about Plato. It's not that there's like a big blue that gets chopped up and handed out like pieces of pizza. It's that blue is entirely located in all those different places. And of course, this seems rather mysterious. So let's get to the analysis of the 6 marbles. So if you were talking to an imminent universal theorist, they would say, in terms of the number of particulars present, they would say 6. So if you asked them, how many particulars here? They would say 6. 6, blue marbles. How many universals and how many instances would be there? Well, in that case, they would say there are 8 different universals with 18 instances that are present. There would be 6 instances of the universal blue. There'd be 6 instances of spherical shape, and 1 instance of each of these 6 sizes. So if we had a bizarre universe consisting of just those marbles, this universe would contain 8 universals and 18 instances. So that's the imminent universal view. So the trope theorist, and again, full disclosure, trope theorist. If you're a trope theorist, you define a trope as a property that is limited to occupying at most 1 location on each dimension at a time. So a quality can only be 1 place at 1 time. And this matches, kind of how we normally observe things, that they can only be 1 place at 1 time. So how would a trope theorist, namely myself, analyze this scenario? Well, I would say, as I did, that there are 24 particulars present. There would be 6 objects, the marbles, and there would be 18 tropes. Now again, we're assuming that there's just like a single trope behind the color, a single trope behind the shape, single trope behind the size, and that could all be totally wrong. But we're just sticking with this for, to keep the example simple. So there'd be 6 exactly resembling blue tropes. There'd be 6 exactly resembling shape tropes, and 6 different, but still resembling size tropes, because they're close in size. So what the trope theorist does is they accept exact resemblance. So they're not identical, they're exactly resembling. And the universal theorist accepts they're identical, the same thing in different places at the same time. Now, of course, to be fair, people who support universals are very skeptical of exactly resembling. And they'll say, pish posh, is that not just identity? And the trope theorist would say back, well, no, it's exactly resembling. It's the same in all ways, but not identical. And then the universal theorist will see that as crazy, and then the trope theorist will see multiplication as crazy. And then since, they're philosophers, they'll, leave it at that, and then maybe fight about it a little later. So, universals versus tropes. So, as I noted, if you were to talk to a universal theorist and a trope theorist, something I've done, that their key distinction there is that identity versus exact resemblance. And as I just noted, that's kind of the core battle. Because if you want to be a person who believes in imminent universals, you kind of have the advantage that the same blue is the same blue, identical, exactly the same. But the cost is multiple location, that the exact same thing has to be in different places at the same time. And again, this is not like taking pizza and cutting up into slices. It's like somehow the whole pizza could be here in Tallahassee, it could be in Washington, D.C., it could be on the moon, all at the same time. The exact same pizza, entirely being in those places. And again, when we looked at Plato, this is seen as kind of a, problem. Now, they both agree, if you talk to a universal theorist and a trope theorist, they both hold a realist view of properties. In this context, realist means literally what it sounds like. They believe the properties are metaphysically real. So, for the trope theorist, like me, we take tropes to be properties which can be located, at most, on a single place on each dimension at the same time. So no multiple location. Now, the article is, of course, entitled Substances and Substrata. So far, I've been troping and universaling, so I have to deliver some substance. Now, I decided to go with our good dead friend Descartes' account of substance, and translate it into the English. He says a substance is a thing which exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. And we've seen throughout the course of the course, there are alternatives. Some philosophers take substance to be the real essence of the thing in question. Others take it to be that which supports properties, which is typically what's taken to be a substrata. Alternatively, it could be, as a third alternative, a thing's most fundamental or categorical properties. And I'll go with the Cartesian definition just because we need a term to talk about that type of thing, and substance is as good as any. Other philosophers, of course, can disagree, and we can use different terms, but for the sake of, being able to talk about it, I'll define substance that way. So what about this independent existence stuff? And this raises interesting questions about, what is the capacity to exist independently? And it also ties into questions like, what would be the minimal universe you could have? Like, what could you have as, say, an entire universe with the least amount of stuff in it? Because that would be an entity that could exist entirely on its own with nothing else. So what would be the least of things? Now, again, I'm going with the Cartesian definition that a substance is an entity whose existence depends on no other entities. And so they're capable of this independent existence. I don't mean like financially independent, it's metaphysical dependence. So the independent existence of things is determined by what I call the dependence hierarchy of the world. What is this dependence hierarchy? Well, these would be various relations of metaphysical dependence that hold between the various entities in terms of what depends on what. as you might imagine, there probably are varying degrees of independence and dependence. I mean, to use like an analogy or metaphor, you can talk about a person being, say, financially independent, that is, say they can, pay their own bills, etc., but they probably have a job, which means in a way they depend on their employer. And of course, they'd also, to get to their job, they would depend on there being roads to get there, so they would depend on, say, other people who built those roads and taxpayers who paid for them. And so there's varying levels of being independent. And I apply this to metaphysics as well. So how do we work this stuff out? Well, so what I do is provide a general definition of substance. And it's going to use some variables, because there's like a tendency in philosophy to use variables, because that way we kind of feel like we're doing math or sciencey stuff. So put in variability terms, we would say that X is an N, where N stands for a number, n-ary, substance, if and only if X's existence is independent of all other n-level entities. So what does that mean? Well, the if thing, you may be wondering, isn't that a typo? Shouldn't there just be like one F there? Well, philosophers, because I guess it's cool, use if, IFF, to stand for if and only if. So if you say P if and only if Q, you're saying if P then Q and if Q then P, all those together. If you've had the logic class, you might have heard of the material biconditional. It's that. And it's also, if you've taken the critical thinking class, it's laying out the necessary and sufficient conditions. So what I'm saying here is something would be a substance of this level. If it is that substance, then it'd be independent of all other things on that level, and something being independent of all other things in that level would make it a substance of that level. So if you had like a secondary substance, that would mean that its existence is independent of all other secondary level entities. And of course, we need like a hierarchy of entities. Again, going back to the person analogy, if you have someone who, say, has a job, they would be like independent in that regard. But of course, then they'd be dependent on their employer to get their money. And so they would be independent, looked at like as people have a job, so they wouldn't be like dependent on, say, their parents. And so we can look at it as kind of a similar way, different levels of dependence. To give an example, one way to think about it is, imagine space and time. So let's just kind of make it up as we so often do. So we think that spatial temporal entities can generally exist independently of one another. So you would keep existing if I stopped to exist. You would keep existing if a tree in California burned up and ceased to exist. So you exist independently of them. You wouldn't cease to be if they didn't exist. But we tend to think that spatial temporal entities are dependent on space-time. So imagine that space-time was destroyed, then everything in space-time presumably would be gone as well. So you could exist apart from, say, a tree in California, but if space-time was suddenly destroyed, well, none of us presumably would exist anymore, at least in this space-time, because there would be none. Now, let's bring God into it, because he's always pretty useful philosophically. So imagine that God creates space-times. Going back to our discussion of God, suppose he is, by hypothesis, creator of all this stuff. So God would make these different space-times, and they could exist independently of each other. So you could have like one space-time, another space-time, and one of them could be destroyed, the other could keep on going. But if God exists and creates space-times, they couldn't exist without him. No God, no space-times. Now, continuing the God talk, God is typically taken as a being that requires nothing else to exist. So he would be, the prime substance, to use as an example, because he exists independently of everything. He requires nothing to exist. Space-time in this example would be a secondary substance, because spatial temporal realities don't require each other to exist. God can make one or 50 or destroy 49 of them and leave one in place, but they would depend on God. And then spatial temporal entities would be tertiary substances, because they can't exist outside of space-time, but they exist independently of each other. Now, what about properties and substrata? So properties are the qualities that a thing has, and the substrata, the usual definition is a substrata is an entity that lies beneath the properties, somehow supporting them or holding them. Now, kind of the general view, which is rejected by many, because that's how philosophy works, is that properties and substrata can't exist independently of one another, because they're at the same ontological level, and they wouldn't be substances. So a property wouldn't be a substance, because it can't exist, apart from other substrata, and substrata wouldn't be substance in this use of the term, because they can't exist apart from properties, perhaps. So, why do we need substances? Well, here's sort of the general argument for the need for substances that I use. So suppose we had just bundles of tropes. In this case, a bundle would just be just a bunch of qualities. And suppose that's the theory we have. There's no substrata, there's just tropes. Now, if you could have bundles of tropes that could exist independently of all other trope bundles, each one would be a substance. Now, if an individual trope could exist apart from other individual tropes, they would also be substances. Now, if you have a group of tropes that are bound by a substratum, and this combination could exist apart from all other such groups, that would also be a substance. So what we're seeing here is the difference between, kind of two main options for trope theorists. Not the only ones, people always make up, more. But there's all you get is tropes, and they all kind of hang out in bundles. Then you got tropes, then you have substrata that tie them together. On both views, you have substances. Either you have a substance as the right kind of bundle of tropes, or it's the right kind of bundle of tropes or right kind of collection of tropes and a substrata. Now, could substances be entirely made of tropes? Well, the trope substratum theory, spoiler, the one I argue for, substances would include at least two types of entities. You got tropes, and you got a substrata, supporting all those tropes, tying them together. Now, intuitively, substances would seem to need to be at least groups of tropes, because claiming that each trope is a substance would seem implausible. After all, the standard argument is, we don't encounter just red all by itself. And it'd be hard to imagine a universe that just had red, not a red thing, but just red, or just had mass, but no other qualities. And so making properties substances seems implausible. Also, relational tropes that, relate entities should not be accepted as substances either, because relations can't exist without related entities. For example, you don't have fatherhood, to use kind of a silly example, just drifting around on its own. You can't, you wouldn't be walking down the street and find fatherhood lying there, sadly discarded. Fatherhood is a relation between father and, child. So the father of. Similarly for distance, you won't just find, the distance between things just by itself, or being larger than. You wouldn't find larger than in a bucket. It's a relation between two things. No, there are philosophers who do argue these are things that can exist on their own, but again, intuitively that seems kind of odd. Now, if tropes are substances, then any single trope could exist independently of all other tropes. So you could have a world, a very tiny universe containing, say, a single mass trope. And that's all, just mass, nothing else. You could have a universe that consists of a single size trope. No mass, no density, no volume, nothing but, just a little size trope, or a big size trope, depending what size it was. But that seems weird. Or even like a pitch trope. Not pitch like the sticky stuff, or like, throwing a thing, but pitch like in, sound and music. And that seems odd. This is all very implausible, the weirdness argument. So single tropes will not seem to do as substances. So at this point, I believe I've established that a substance will have to consist of at least multiple tropes. So kind of a minimal substance would be multiple tropes. Now, of course, at this point, we just talk about substances primarily, and it seems like we got to have them maybe. What about substrata? Well, we'll move on to that in the next video. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.